Go.
Hey, I'm James Wiesman, a chemistry expert, and I'm here to tell you about compounds. The first thing you need to know is that there's two types of compounds, ionic and covalent. Covalent compounds are composed of two nonmetals. Ionic compounds usually have a metal in them or start with an H and are an acid. When determining the name of a compound, one must first find the first letter of the compound. If that first letter is H, then your compound is an acid. Well done. You've determined that your substance is an acid if it contains an H at the beginning. Now, once you know that it is an acid, there are two main types of acids. One contains oxygen and the other does not. Now, if it does not contain oxygen, what you must do is take the element and add hydro at the beginning and replace the suffix of the element with ic, creating something like hydrochloric acid for chlorine. Other common acids with this naming method are hydrofluoric acid and hydrobromic acid for the elements fluorine and bromine. Now that we've determined what you should do if your acid does not contain an oxygen, I'll now show you what to do if it does. If your acid contains an oxygen, that means that it contains a polyatomic ion. Now that you know that your acid contains a polyatomic ion, you need to use your polyatomic ion name reference sheet and look up the name of the polyatomic ion. Once you find the name, find out if the polyatomic ion suffix is ate or ite. Now that you know that your polyatomic ends in ate, here are the steps you go through to name this acid. First, you write the name of the polyatomic ion. Second, take the element and replace the suffix with -ic, like so. With sulfur in sulfate, you would turn it into sulfuric acid. With nitrate, nitrogen, you would turn it into nitric acid. Now, if your polyatomic ion ends in -ite, you have a couple of options. Does the polyatomic ion contain the prefix hypo? If your polyatomic ion does not contain the prefix hypo, then simply replace the suffix with -ous. For sulfite containing sulfur, the name would be sulfurous acid. For chlorite containing chlorine, it would be chlorous acid. Fun fact! A polyatomic ion is a group of two or more elements bonded with an overall charge. Congratulations! You've learned how to name acids. Now you must learn how to name other compounds. The first thing you must ask yourself when naming another chemical compound is, does this compound have a metal? How do I find a metal, you ask? Well, a metal is everything from this line of the periodic table to the right, excluding hydrogen, stopping at this line that I've drawn in here, and not including these three elements, flerovium and unum pentum, and this unum element here. If neither of your elements is a metal in your compound, then you know that it is a covalent compound. Covalent compounds are composed of, as you could guess, two nonmetals. The naming rules for this type of compound are pretty basic. You simply take the first element and state how many of them there are, such as 2 di, 3 tri, or 4 tetra, and add it as a prefix here. And for the second element, you do the same. However, if there's only one of the first element, do not use mono. But if there is only one of the second element, use mono. Here we have dinitrogen tetroxide and carbon monoxide. If your compound contains a metal, things get a little bit more complicated. First, you must ask yourself, is the metal a transition metal? Transition metals are located in the D block of the periodic table between scandium and zinc here. Now, if your element is silver, zinc, cadmium, or aluminum, this does not count as a transition metal and does not have the same properties in chemical naming. If your element is a transition metal, or is one of the elements listed a moment ago, then you must find if your compound contains a polyatomic ion. If your compound is composed of a non-transition metal and a polyatomic ion, make sure to name your metal first in completion and then the polyatomic ion. Do not add a suffix like "ide" at the end. If your non-transition metal compound contains no polyatomic ion, just a metal and a non-metal, you will name the metal first, then the non-metal with the suffix "ide" at the end of the non-metal. You name these elements like so. SrF2, strontium and fluorine, is simply strontium fluoride. Note the "ide" replaced as the suffix. Now, the complex part about this is the charges. Strontium has a +2 charge, while fluorine has a -1 charge. Now, to balance this compound and keep both elements happy, we need to add 2 fluorines in order to balance out the 2 strontiums. Charges. With these exception elements, you simply take the metal and the non-metal and add "ide" at the end, like Ag3N, silver nitride, or aluminum nitride, ALN. Now here we have these metals with a polyatomic ion. Simply take the metal and the polyatomic ion and just stick them together. You don't need to change any endings or prefixes, just potassium nitrate. You can also see this here in sodium carbonate, NaCO3. In the formula, you just write the metal, like Na, and then the polyatomic ion, like CO3 or NO2. Good job. You now know how to name compounds with a non-transition metal and a non-metal. Now, I will show you how to name transition metals with non-metals. When naming transition metals, the first question you must ask yourself is, does the compound contain a polyatomic ion? You can find this out by seeing if there are 2 or more elements. If your compound contains a transition metal and no polyatomic ion, or only 2 elements, then you must do this. You must name the metal first and then the non-metal. You must find the charge of the non-metal, in this case oxygen, it's -2, and add 2 charges in the Roman numerals after the metal. Also, when naming these, you must add a -ide suffix to the end of the non-metal. Here we have another example, copper 2 carbide. Carbon's charge is -2, so we make up 2 electrons with the Roman numerals. Copper 2 carbide. Another example is cobalt 2 chloride. Here's the formula, CO2 chloride, -2 charge, add 2 electrons after the cobalt. For transition metals that contain a polyatomic ion, one simply must name the metal first and then the polyatomic ion without changing it at all. However, you must do a similar charge routine with Roman numerals as you did with the non-polyatomic ions. Simply Find the charge of your polyatomic ion. For example, here we have iron 2 selenate, SeO4, and selenate has a -2 charge, so we have to add 2 to the iron. Cobalt 2 sulfate, cobalt adds 2 to make up for the sulfate's -2 charge. Another way to write a transition metal in polyatomic is by going metal, then your polyatomic, and then instead of Roman numerals, you can write a 2 in parentheses here. This has been James Weisman's expert guide to chemical nomenclature and everything you need to know for intro chemistry at St. Andrews.